Your grandparents weren't tough. They were just too broke to sue. Look at this 1959 Cadillac. Gorgeous, right? It's also a 4,000-pound chrome murder weapon with tail fins sharp enough to gut a deer, a gas tank one fender bender away from turning you into a Roman candle, and doors that fly open on the highway like the car is trying to evict you. Detroit slapped luxury on the brochure and charged people extra for seatbelts, like sprinkles. And the wildest part? Zero federal safety laws until 1966. So for 60 years, car companies legally sold flaming death pods with ashtrays. I found 111 of these war crimes on wheels, and number 55 will have you hugging your Toyota tonight. Smash that subscribe button before the suicide doors yeet you out of here. 1. Back in 1965, a Buick barreling down a Texas highway had a steering column that was basically a steel spear pointed directly at the driver's chest. Engineers genuinely believed rigid meant safe and strong meant smart. Then, a young lawyer named Ralph Nader rolled up and called it the second collision because the first crash stopped the car and the second crash stopped the driver right through the sternum. Doctors across the country started seeing the same gruesome chest injury over and over again. The wheel did not protect anybody. It skewered them like a kebab on the freeway. 2. A family driving home from a Sunday picnic in 1962 hits the brakes when a deer jumps the road and suddenly the windshield becomes the villain. That plate glass sounded fancy, but it actually shattered into long blade-shaped shards the size of swords. Medical examiners across America had a whole filing cabinet category for crash decapitations because heads kept coming clean off in fender benders. Mothers begged automakers for laminated glass for decades and got absolutely nothing. Highway cops joked grimly that the windshield finished the job the dashboard started. Detroit just kept selling these rolling guillotines. 3. The Ford Pinto was supposed to be America's cute little economy car of the 1970s, but it had one tiny problem where the gas tank exploded if anybody tapped it from behind at 21 miles per hour. Ford executives knew this. They literally sat in a boardroom with a document called the Grush-Sonby Report and calculated that paying out lawsuits for burned families would cost $49 million while fixing the car would cost $137 million. They picked the cheaper option. Owners called their Pintos the barbecue that seats 4. Mothers in California started refusing to drive behind one on the freeway. 4. The 1959 Chevy Bel Air looked like a chrome battleship and weighed about as much, so people assumed it would survive anything. Then in 2009, the Insurance Institute decided to crash a Bel Air into a 2009 Malibu just for fun, and the results were absolutely brutal. The Bel Air folded like a cheap lawn chair. The A-pillar caved in. The steering column launched straight through the dummy's head like a medieval jousting tournament. Grandpa always bragged about how they built cars solid back in his day. Grandpa was wrong. Grandpa was driving a tin can with attitude. 5. Suicide doors were exactly as charming as they sound, and they were standard equipment on Lincolns and Cadillacs and even church wagons. The hinges sat at the back instead of the front, which meant if the latch popped open at 50 miles per hour, the wind grabbed the door like a sail. The door ripped off the body. Whoever was sitting next to it usually went with it. Funeral directors in Detroit said you could spot the victims because they were still gripping their hats. Hollywood loved these doors for gangster movies. Real families on real roads absolutely did not love them. 6. The Chevy Corvair was supposed to be General Motors' answer to the Volkswagen Beetle, and it had this cute little rear engine and a swing axle suspension that sounded German and sophisticated. It also flipped over if you took a corner too fast at the grocery store. The rear wheel would tuck under the car, and suddenly Mom was upside down in a ditch. Ralph Nader wrote a whole book about it called Unsafe at Any Speed in 1965, and General Motors got so mad they hired private detectives to follow him around. The detectives found nothing. Nader became a national hero. 7. Lap belts were sold to American families as the miracle of modern safety in the 1960s. Slap that strap across your waist and you were invincible. Except doctors started noticing a brand new injury pattern in emergency rooms that they nicknamed seatbelt syndrome. The belt acted like a fulcrum across the abdomen, so in a crash the intestines ruptured and the spine snapped at the lumbar in something called a chance fracture. Surgeons in Ohio said they could literally see the belt's outline bruised across the patient's stomach. The cure was almost worse than the crash. Almost. 8. Before crash test dummies existed, automakers needed bodies to slam into walls and rocket sleds, so they used the next best thing, which was real human cadavers. The United States Air Force strapped corpses into sleds at New Mexico bases and dropped them off towers. Universities like Wayne State kept the practice going for decades into the 1990s. Engineers nicknamed the bodies their test pilots. A guy named Samuel Alderson finally invented Sierra Sam in 1949 to replace them with a mannequin. The cadaver program never fully stopped, though. Somewhere in Michigan, a grandpa donated his body to science and ended up in a Buick. 9. Hood ornaments in the 1950s were not decorations. They were chrome spears mounted on top of 2-ton vehicles aimed directly at pedestrians. The Jaguar Leopard was particularly nasty because it was a metal cat, frozen mid-pounce. If a Jaguar tagged a kid crossing the street, the Leopard went in first and the bumper finished the introduction. European regulators finally caught on in the 1970s and forced automakers to make collapsible ornaments. America took its sweet time. Salesmen at dealerships kept bragging about how the ornament caught the sunlight. The ornament also caught grandmas crossing Main Street. 10. Before September 1967, there were 0 federal car safety standards in the entire United States of America. Automakers could legally sell a vehicle with brakes made of cardboard and a dashboard made of broken bottles if they felt like it. Then President Lyndon Johnson signed the National Traffic and Motor Vehicle Safety Act of 1966, and suddenly, Detroit had to actually try. Industry executives complained that safety would bankrupt them. It did not bankrupt them. They just had to stop selling rolling crime scenes. Every car built in America before that law was a legally permitted decapitation machine on wheels. 11. Acetylene headlamps were standard equipment on cars well into the 1910s, and they worked exactly like they sound, which is terrifying. There was a pressurized gas tank bolted to the running board, feeding actual open flame into 2 lanterns near the front wheels. Drivers in Pennsylvania would light them with a match before pulling out of the driveway. If the car hit a bump, the tank could leak. If the leak found the flame, the whole front end became a fireball. Mechanics called these cars rolling Hindenburgs, decades before the actual Hindenburg even existed. Pedestrians prayed before crossing the street at dusk. 12. The Model T hand crank was Henry Ford's gift to broken forearms across America. To start the car, you grabbed a metal handle at the front and spun it hard. If the engine backfired, the crank whipped backwards at full speed and snapped your arm clean in half. Doctors in Detroit saw the injury so often, they named it the Ford fracture because it always spiraled the bone the exact same way. Farmers learned to crank with their thumb tucked under to avoid losing it. Henry Ford himself reportedly broke his wrist starting one. The Model T humbled everybody equally. 13. Vacuum windshield wipers were a brilliant idea on paper because they used engine suction instead of electricity. Then, somebody actually drove one in the rain. The second, a driver pressed the gas pedal. The engine sucked all the vacuum away from the wipers and the blades just stopped dead in the middle of the windshield. Climbing a hill in a Pennsylvania thunderstorm meant either accelerating blind or slowing down while semis honked from behind. Mothers across the Midwest learned to time their wipes between gas pedal presses. Detroit engineers knew about the flaw. They sold the cars anyway for 30 straight years. 14. The 1948 Tucker 48 was supposed to be the car of the future, and it had a designated crash compartment built into the dashboard. The idea was that the front seat passenger would dive into a padded cubby right before impact. Preston Tucker genuinely believed passengers would have time to throw themselves into a metal hole at 60 miles per hour. He also forgot to install seat belts, so even if the passengers somehow predicted the crash, they would just bounce right back out. The Tucker only sold 51 cars before the company collapsed. The crash cubby remains the most optimistic safety feature ever designed. 15. Tube tires were the standard until 1947, and they had a habit of exploding without any warning whatsoever at highway speeds. Inside the rubber tire was an inner tube full of pressurized air, and one tiny puncture meant instant catastrophic blowout. A front tire popping at 60 miles per hour basically guaranteed a rollover into the ditch. Truckers in Texas carried 3 or 4 spares because losing one tire a trip was just the cost of doing business. Goodyear knew tubeless was safer. They held back the technology for decades because tubes were more profitable. Families paid the price in funerals. 16. The 1958 Edsel was Ford's biggest financial disaster, and one of the reasons was a feature called Teletouch, which put the transmission buttons inside the steering wheel hub. The exact spot where the horn used to live now controlled whether the car went forward or backward. Drivers in New Jersey would honk at a slow truck and accidentally shift into reverse at 50 miles per hour. The transmission would scream. The gears would shatter. The Edsel would coast to a stop while everybody behind it laughed. Ford spent millions promoting this feature. Customers spent millions repairing their transmissions. Teletouch lasted exactly 1 model year. 17. Before 1956, most American cars did not need a key to start. There was a little knob on the dash that you twisted. If the road got bumpy enough, the knob could rotate by itself and the engine would fire up while you were parked. Farmers in Iowa reported coming out to the barn and finding their truck idling in the driveway after a thunderstorm shook it awake. Car thieves loved this design because stealing a car required exactly 0 skills. The auto industry resisted ignition keys for decades because customers complained keys were annoying. The customers were idiots. 18. The 1936 Cord 810 had hidden headlights that you cranked open by hand from inside the cabin. There was a literal hand crank on the dashboard next to the steering wheel. As the sun set, the driver had to reach down, find the crank, and start turning while still steering the car down a country road. By the time the headlights popped up, the driver had usually crashed into a fence or a cow or a neighbor's mailbox. The Cord was beautiful and revolutionary and absolutely lethal at dusk. Indiana farmers learned to leave the lights up all day just to be safe. 19. Mechanical drum brakes on long mountain descents would heat up so much they faded down to literally 0 stopping power. Truckers crossing the Rockies in the 1940s would feel the pedal go soft halfway down the grade and have to drag the parking brake the rest of the way like a medieval anchor. Some drivers carried buckets of water to splash on the drums at scenic overlooks. Others just prayed. Runaway truck ramps were invented specifically because of this nightmare. Whole families in Colorado vacation cars would coast into ditches at 40 miles per hour with smoke pouring out of every wheel. 20. The 1953 Corvette had no exterior door handles, which Chevrolet marketed as sleek and futuristic and European. What it actually meant was that if the inside latch jammed, the occupants were sealed inside a fiberglass tomb. Fiberglass also happens to burn extremely well. Firefighters in Michigan reported needing axes to chop drivers out of locked Corvettes after minor fender benders. The handles were eventually added back because customers kept dying in their driveways trying to escape their own sports car. Chevrolet called it a design refinement. Survivors called it finally getting a door handle like every other car. 21. Sun visors in the 1950s were not the soft padded flaps we know today. They were stamped sheets of steel with sharp pressed edges hanging directly above the driver's forehead. In any frontal collision, the driver's head whipped forward and then snapped back into the visor like a meat slicer. Emergency room doctors in Chicago saw the same horizontal forehead laceration on accident victims so often they could identify a car crash from across the waiting room. Detroit marketed these as sun protection. Surgeons called them the metal eyebrow. Nobody at the factory ever asked why visors needed to be made of literal weaponized steel. 22. Pre-1947 wheel rims held the tire on using nothing but air pressure and pure optimism. There was no safety bead, no locking ridge, nothing. If a driver in Oklahoma took a corner too hard, the tire could literally roll right off the rim while the car was moving. The car would drop onto the bare metal wheel and start throwing sparks like a fireworks display down Main Street. Mechanics called this losing your shoe. Highway Patrol called it Tuesday. Goodyear knew safer rim designs existed in Europe, but American manufacturers thought the upgrade cost was just too darn expensive to bother with. 23. In 1959, a Swedish engineer named Niels Bolin invented the modern 3-point seatbelt for Volvo, and it was so good it has been credited with saving over 1 million lives. Then Volvo did something almost nobody in corporate history has ever done. They released the patent for free to every automaker on the planet. Detroit executives in their wood-paneled offices basically shrugged and said, "No thanks" for years. American families kept flying through windshields while Swedish families buckled in safely. Volvo proved you could put humanity over profit. Detroit proved you could put profit over humanity. 24. Wooden brake shoes were standard equipment on cars built before 1925. And yes, they were made of actual wood. The shoe pressed against a metal drum, and friction stopped the car, which also generated tremendous heat. On long downhill runs in places like the Appalachians, the wood could literally catch fire mid-descent. Drivers would smell smoke and look down to see flames licking out of their wheel wells like a campfire on the freeway. Some owners packed extra shoes in the trunk because brakes were considered a consumable item. Stopping the car required burning the car. America accepted this trade. 25. The 1971 Chevy Vega had an all-aluminum engine block with absolutely no iron cylinder liners because GM thought aluminum was the future. The future turned out to be cylinder walls scoring themselves into oblivion at highway speed. Vegas across America started seizing up around 50,000 miles and dropping their pistons onto interstates. Owners in Ohio reported the engine just stopping forever in the middle of a Tuesday commute. General Motors knew about the defect before launch. They shipped the car anyway. The Vega became such a punchline that comedians on Johnny Carson got laughs just by saying the word Vega. 26. Tempered side glass was sold to American families as a major safety upgrade because it broke into little pebbles instead of long shards. The problem was that the glass would break into those little pebbles if literally anything tapped it at all. A stray rock from a gravel truck on Route 66 could shatter the entire window in a split second of bad luck. A baseball from a kid's backyard or a confused pigeon flying into traffic would do exactly the same thing instantly. Mom would be blinded mid-drive while the kids in the back seat screamed at the sudden explosion of glass cubes around them. 27. The Stanley steamer ran on a kerosene-fired boiler, mounted directly under the driver's seat. Imagine sitting on a pressure cooker the size of a beer keg full of superheated water and burning fuel. If the pressure relief valve stuck shut, the whole thing could rupture and parboil everybody in the passenger compartment. Massachusetts drivers reported feeling the seat get uncomfortably warm, right before things got really exciting. The Stanley brothers insisted their boilers had never exploded in normal operation. Define normal. The steamer was faster than any gasoline car of its era. It was also a saddle on a bomb. 28. Before 1955, federal law in the United States did not require brake lights on automobiles. Drivers signaled a stop by sticking their bare arm out the driver's window and pointing downward. At night, this worked exactly as well as you would expect, which is not at all. Rear-end collisions happened constantly because the only warning a trailing driver got was a faint shadow waving in the dark. Mothers driving home from church in Mississippi would stick their hand out into pouring rain just to slow down. Some states added optional brake lights as a luxury upgrade. Survival was an option package. 29. The 1948 Hudson featured a step-down design where the floor sat below the door sill. Engineers bragged it was lower and sleeker than anything in Detroit. What they forgot to mention was that in a side impact, the passenger's legs were trapped underneath the door beam, like a mousetrap. T-bone collisions in Ohio left Hudson drivers with shattered femurs that doctors could not even reach without cutting the car apart. Hudson advertised the step-down as the safest car in America. Surgeons disagreed politely. The lawsuits eventually disagreed loudly. The step-down quietly disappeared by the mid-1950s. 30. Bias ply tires were standard equipment on every American car well into the 1970s, and they had one really charming habit. The internal heat generated at highway speeds would cause the tread to peel right off the tire during a long drive. A family vacationing through Arizona in August would hear a loud bang and watch a long black ribbon of rubber sail past the windshield. The bare tire carcass would shake the entire car like an earthquake and usually end the family trip in a roadside ditch. Truckers called these shed treads gators because they looked like alligators sunbathing on the highway. Detroit resisted radial tires for decades. 31. Before 1966, there was no federal standard for how strong a car's roof had to be, which meant convertibles were basically motorized picnic blankets with engines. A rollover on a Kansas highway in a Chrysler 300 meant the only thing between the driver's skull and the asphalt was a folded canvas top and a prayer. Highway patrol officers responding to convertible rollovers would not even bother bringing the jaws of life. There was nothing to cut through. Detroit kept selling these cars as glamorous and sporty for 2 full decades. Frank Sinatra looked cool in his. Frank Sinatra also had really good luck. 32. The 1962 Studebaker Avanti was supposed to be America's answer to European sports cars, and it had a sleek fiberglass body that designers swore was the future of automotive engineering. The future apparently meant exploding into 1,000 pieces during low-speed parking lot crashes. Avanti owners in California reported tapping a curb at 5 miles per hour and watching their entire rear quarter panel turn into white powder. Underneath the fiberglass was nothing but a bare steel skeleton, like a hot dog with no bun. Studebaker went bankrupt in 1963. The Avanti somehow kept being built by a different company for decades. 33. The 1965 Buick Riviera had hidden headlights that ran on vacuum motors, which sounds futuristic until you understand how vacuum works. The motors held the lights open by sucking air through hoses, and overnight the hoses lost their seal as the rubber cooled. Owners in Wisconsin would wake up at dawn to find their headlights still hidden behind closed doors. Trying to drive to work meant either no headlights or sitting in the driveway for 10 minutes waiting for the engine vacuum to build pressure. Buick called this a styling triumph. Owners called it the Cyclops that fell asleep at the worst possible moment. 34. General Motors? X-frame chassis dominated the late 1950s, and it was exactly what it sounds like, which is an X-shaped piece of steel running down the middle of the car with absolutely nothing on the sides. In a T-bone crash, there was no side rail to absorb the impact. The intruding car came straight through the door, the seat, and the driver all in one motion. Engineers in Detroit called it a brilliant weight-saving design. Coroners in Michigan called it the easiest paperwork they ever filled out. GM quietly switched back to perimeter frames in the 1960s and never apologized. 35. Headlight dimmer switches in the 1950s lived on the floor right next to the clutch pedal. Drivers were supposed to tap them gently with their left foot to flip between high beams and low beams. In the middle of a foggy night in Tennessee, a driver trying to dim for oncoming traffic would frequently mash the clutch instead and grind the transmission into oblivion. Or worse, mash the brake and send everybody through the windshield. The switch lived inches from disaster. Detroit thought this was perfectly fine for 30 years. Steering column stalks finally arrived and saved 1 million transmissions overnight. 36. Before 1969, American law had no requirement for child-proof rear door locks, which meant any toddler with curious fingers could pop the door open at 45 miles per hour. Mothers in suburban Connecticut would glance in the rearview mirror and watch their 3-year-old vanish out the back of the station wagon onto the shoulder of Route 1. Pediatricians had a specific phrase for it called pavement ejection. The fix existed in Europe for years. Detroit ignored it because nobody asked loud enough. Once one senator's grandchild fell out of a Cadillac, the law finally changed. America runs on senators losing grandchildren. 37. Before 1973, car trunks had no internal release latch, meaning once the lid slammed shut, you were trapped inside a steel coffin. Children playing hide-and-seek in driveways across Ohio would climb into Dad's Plymouth trunk and suffocate before anybody noticed they were missing. Kidnap victims faced the same problem with worse intentions involved. The fix was a glow-in-the-dark handle inside the trunk that cost roughly 70 cents per car. Detroit refused to install it for decades because nobody was demanding it. They demanded it after enough funerals stacked up. 70 cents took 30 years to install. 38. The 1957 Ford Skyliner had a retractable hardtop that was the engineering marvel of its era, and also a complete electrical disaster. It used 10 separate motors, 4 hydraulic jacks, 10 solenoids, 8 circuit breakers, and 610 feet of wiring to fold the roof into the trunk. If anything failed mid-cycle, the roof would just hang there in the air like a confused metal butterfly. Owners in Florida reported pulling into restaurants with the roof frozen halfway up and having to drive home that way. Mechanics charged a fortune to fix them. Ford built the Skyliner for 3 glorious, chaotic years. 39. The 1959 Cadillac had tail fins that reached an absurd 42 inches above the ground and ended in a sharpened chrome bullet shape that pointed straight at pedestrians. These were not subtle. They were taller and pointier than any production car fin before or since. A jaywalker in Brooklyn getting clipped by a caddy would not just be hit, they would be skewered like a kebab on a chrome rotisserie. New York City actually filed reports of pedestrians literally pinned to walls by parked Cadillacs. Harley Earl called the design space age and elegant. Pedestrians called it the chrome harpoon. 40. Drum brakes that drove through even a shallow puddle could lose almost all their stopping power for a full mile, until the friction surfaces finally dried out. A driver in Louisiana hitting a flooded intersection at 30 miles per hour would push the brake pedal and feel absolutely nothing happen. The car would just keep gliding forward through the next 3 intersections like a cruise ship in a swamp. Mechanics advised drivers to ride the brake lightly after rain, just to scrub the water off. America accepted that braking after rain was optional for almost 50 years. Disc brakes eventually rescued everybody from this nonsense. 41. The 1961 Lincoln Continental was the king of suicide doors, those gorgeous rear-hinged doors that opened backward like a limousine. Then Ford realized passengers were literally getting sucked out of the car when somebody accidentally bumped the handle at highway speed. A Texas oil man riding in the back seat of his Continental would lean against the door, the latch would pop, and suddenly he was tumbling down Route 75. Ford engineers eventually wired in an electronic lock that engaged above 5 miles per hour. Until then, the solution was just hoping nobody leaned. Jackie Kennedy rode in a Continental on a famous Dallas afternoon. 42. Before 1972, fuel tanks had no rollover check valve, which meant flipping a car upside down turned the gas tank into a backyard sprinkler. Gasoline would drain out through the carburetor and pour directly onto the red-hot engine block below. Highway Patrol in Arizona had a grim phrase for it called the rollover roast. A family in a Ford station wagon that rolled in the desert had maybe 90 seconds before the whole car became a campfire. The fix was a tiny plastic valve that cost about $1. Detroit installed it after enough lawsuits made the math work in favor of life. 43. The 1948 Crosley Hotshot was the first American production car with disc brakes, which sounds revolutionary until you find out the bonded steel rotors literally fell apart in humid weather. Crosley owners in Florida and Louisiana reported the rotors delaminating like cheap plywood after one rainy summer. The brakes would suddenly grab unevenly or just stop working entirely while pulling into a gas station. Crosley quietly recalled every disc brake car and replaced them with old-fashioned drums. The future of braking technology lasted exactly long enough to embarrass everybody. Disc brakes did not return to American cars seriously until the 1960s. 44. Before 1970, federal law did not require hazard flashers on cars. So, a stranded driver on a highway shoulder had exactly one warning device available, which was a burning road flare. Dad would pop the trunk on Interstate 80 in Nebraska, light a flare with a match, and stand in the dark waving fire at semi-trucks doing 70. Sometimes the flare set the grass on fire. Sometimes it set the driver's coat on fire. Sometimes a semi just plowed straight through anyway. State troopers handed out flares like candy because there was literally nothing else. Hazard buttons saved more lives than people realize. 45. Gear shift levers in 1910s. Cars were 3 to 4 feet tall and mounted outside the body of the car, sticking up from the running board like a wooden harpoon. A driver in Ohio making a panic stop would slam forward and the shifter would slam straight into his ribs like a medieval lance. Doctors documented entire rib cages cracked open by gear levers in collisions barely fast enough to spill coffee. Ford and Buick eventually moved shifters to the steering column where they belonged. Before that, every panic stop included the possibility of being impaled by your own transmission. The transmission usually won. 46. Before 1968, dashboards across America were studded with unpadded steel knobs. for the radio, the choke, the headlights, and the cigarette lighter. These knobs were positioned at exactly the height of the front passenger's eye sockets. In any frontal collision, the passenger's face whipped forward and met the dashboard at full speed. Emergency room doctors in Detroit nicknamed it the radio knob orbital because the round knob left a perfect circular fracture in the eye socket. Padded dashboards existed in Europe for years. Detroit thought padding looked cheap. American passengers paid the price one eyeball at a time for decades. 47. White wall tires were the height of 1950s style, and every Cadillac and Buick rolled out of the showroom with those bright white sidewalls glistening in the sun. The dirty secret was that the rubber compound used to make white walls bright was softer and less durable than regular black walls. Goodyear and Firestone knew white walls failed roughly 30% more often than their identical black twin tires. A family driving home from Daytona Beach in their new Bel Air might lose a white wall to a blowout twice as fast as their neighbor in plain blacks. Detroit kept selling them because they looked fantastic in advertisements. 48. The Ford Model T had only 2 brakes, and both of them lived on the rear axle, which meant stopping from 30 miles per hour took nearly 70 feet of clear road. A horse and buggy could stop faster than a Model T. Henry Ford genuinely believed front brakes were unnecessary because the rear ones were so effective. They were not effective. Iowa farmers driving Model Ts into intersections regularly found themselves coasting through stop signs like a runaway shopping cart. Pedestrians learned to never trust a Model T to actually stop. Henry Ford finally added front brakes in 1928 after 20 years of complaints. 49. Preston Tucker gave the 48 a famous third headlight in the center of the grille that turned with the steering wheel like a cyclops eye. He called it the safest headlight in America because it lit up the road around corners during night driving. Then Illinois passed a law saying any car with more than 2 headlights was illegal to drive at night. 7 other states followed the Illinois ruling within months of the original decision. The Tucker became a felony in half the country before sunset across America. Engineers had to design a metal cover that fastened over the third lamp in those states. Preston Tucker could not catch a break. 50. Ford launched the 1929 Model A with its gas tank mounted in the cowl directly in front of the driver's knees inside the cabin. The tank was separated from the passenger compartment by exactly 1 thin sheet of stamped steel, without any additional crash protection at all. In any frontal collision, the tank would rupture immediately and gasoline poured directly into the driver's lap within just a few short seconds. The engine sat right next to that tank, generating constant sparks and tremendous heat under the hood throughout every minute of driving. A New Jersey commuter rear-ending a milk truck would basically be sitting inside a kiddie pool of raw gasoline waiting for ignition. 51. Before sealed beam headlights became mandatory in 1940, every automaker designed their own bulbs, which meant night driving in America was a complete coin flip. A Packard had bright, clean light. A cheap Chevrolet had 2 yellow candles fighting the darkness. A Studebaker had something in between that flickered when the engine idled. Drivers in rural Tennessee learned to memorize the road in daylight because their headlights might barely reach 30 feet at night. Oncoming cars varied from blinding spotlights to barely visible glows. Sealed beams finally standardized everything in 1940. Until then, driving home after sunset in America was basically guessing where the road went. 52. Before 1968, windshields were held in place by rubber gaskets that dried out and turned brittle within about 5 years. A driver in Arizona who hit a pothole hard enough could literally watch his entire windshield pop loose from the frame and slide off the hood like a giant glass coaster. Sometimes the windshield landed in the front yard of a confused homeowner. Sometimes it hit the car behind. Repair shops kept spare gaskets in stock because the failure was so common. Detroit knew bonded windshields were safer. They cost more, so nobody installed them. America drove around with windshields held in by old rubber bands. 53. The knee bolster did not exist until the 1970s, which meant for decades the front passenger had nothing protecting their legs except a steel dashboard. In any frontal crash, the passenger's knees slammed into the lower dash and the femurs shattered like dropped chopsticks. Orthopedic surgeons in Cleveland called it dashboard knee because the injury was so consistent they could diagnose it from the angle of the brake. The padded knee bolster cost about $3 to add. Detroit refused for 30 years because $3 times a million cars added up. $3 million saved Ford a lot of broken legs worth of lawsuits. 54. Before 1967, there was no federal requirement for side marker lights on American cars, which meant a vehicle waiting at a country intersection at night was completely invisible from the side. A truck driver on Route 30 in Pennsylvania would round a bend, and suddenly there was an entire Buick sitting sideways in his lane that nobody saw until headlights swept across it. T-bone collisions at unlit intersections became so common that Highway Patrol called them blackout crashes. The fix was a tiny orange bulb on each fender. Detroit waited until federal law forced them. Until then, darkness hid entire automobiles. 55. Hydraulic brakes did not become standard on Ford vehicles until 1939 because Henry Ford himself personally insisted that mechanical brakes were safer. Every other major automaker in the world had switched to hydraulics years earlier because the math was obvious. Henry was a brilliant industrialist and also a stubborn old man who refused to be told he was wrong. Ford drivers in Michigan kept stomping on cable-operated brakes that stretched and slipped while Chevrolets next to them stopped on a dime. Dealers begged Ford to upgrade. He refused for years. Finally, his son Edsel convinced him. Henry Ford reluctantly joined the modern era. 56. Nash offered factory-installed seatbelts as a $20 option in 1949, which made them the first American automaker to put belts in showroom cars. Then, absolutely nobody bought them. American customers thought belts looked weird and felt restrictive and suggested the car might actually be dangerous. Salesmen in Wisconsin reported families laughing at the idea of strapping themselves into a car. Nash quietly killed the option 2 years later because it embarrassed the dealers. The lesson Detroit took away was that safety did not sell. That lesson poisoned American car design for the next 20 years. Nash was right too early. 57. In 1934, General Motors decided to test how a Chevrolet would survive a crash by simply driving one off a 100-foot cliff in Michigan. There were no instruments inside the car, no high-speed cameras, no dummies, nothing. Engineers stood at the bottom of the cliff with clipboards and inspected the twisted wreckage afterward to estimate what happened. They basically guessed at the forces involved by squinting at bent steel. This was considered cutting-edge automotive safety research at the time. Modern crash testing uses laser sensors and 1,000 frame-per-second cameras. GM in 1934 used a guy named Carl with a clipboard. 58. Goodyear introduced the captive air-run flat tire in 1958 as the future of safe driving because the tire could keep rolling after a puncture. The problem was that the tire weighed so much more than a regular tire that it absolutely destroyed wheel bearings on thousands of American cars. Cadillac and Lincoln owners who bought captive airs reported their front bearings failing within a year. The repair cost more than the tires themselves. Goodyear quietly discontinued them after a few model years. The future of safe driving turned out to be a future of expensive bearing replacements. Run flats returned decades later, much lighter. 59. Before 1973, bumpers had no federal height standard, so a sedan and a pickup truck colliding was basically a guillotine demonstration. The pickup's bumper sat about 8 inches higher than the sedan's, which meant in a head-on crash, the truck's bumper went directly through the sedan's windshield. A family in a Chevy Impala meeting a Ford F-100 on a country road in Georgia would have the truck's chrome bar enter the cabin at the exact level of the driver's neck. Federal height standards finally arrived in 1973. Until then, the pickup truck was a moving guillotine on the highway. 60. The Mercedes 300 SL was the most beautiful sports car of the 1950s with its iconic gull-wing doors that opened upward like a butterfly. Then the car rolled over in a turn at Le Mans, and everybody discovered that gull-wing doors are completely impossible to open when the car is upside down. The hinges sat at the roof center line, so gravity pinned them shut against the pavement. American buyers in Los Angeles who flipped their 300 SLs found themselves trapped inside a beautiful aluminum coffin. The only way out was through the small rear window. The car was art. The exit strategy was nightmare fuel. 61. The 1960 Plymouth Valiant introduced America to torsion bar suspension, which Chrysler engineers swore was the smoothest ride in the country. The torsion bar was a long steel rod that twisted to absorb bumps instead of using regular coil springs. Then, drivers across Pennsylvania started hitting potholes, and the bars cracked clean off at the anchor point. The front wheel would drop out of the bottom of the car without any warning at all. Valiant owners reported their cars nosediving straight into the pavement at highway speed. Chrysler eventually beefed up the anchor mounts after enough complaints. Until then, potholes were eating Valiants alive across the country. 62. The Volkswagen Beetle was the most popular import car in America during the 1960s, and its air-cooled engine had a unique cabin heating system. The system pulled warm air across the exhaust manifold and piped it into the passenger compartment through floor vents. When that manifold cracked, deadly carbon monoxide flowed straight into the cabin without any warning. Families driving Beetles across Nevada in winter would crank the heat and slowly drift off at the wheel. Coroners across the western states called it the Volkswagen lullaby because the symptoms were so consistent. The fix was a basic manifold inspection. Most owners never knew to check. 63. Before 1965, power windows had no obstruction sensors built into the motor housings whatsoever. The motors could crush absolutely anything in their path with several hundred pounds of force. A toddler in the back of a Cadillac, leaning over the door sill to wave at grandma, could lose a finger in just seconds. Worse than that, a child sticking their head out and bumping the switch with an elbow could close the glass around their throat. Emergency rooms in Chicago documented multiple child suffocations from rogue power windows every single year. The fix was a $5 pressure sensor that Detroit refused to install for decades. 64. The 1937 Studebaker offered an optional feature called the hill holder brake that was genuinely clever engineering for its era. The mechanism kept the car from rolling backward while drivers switched from clutch to gas on an incline. The little hydraulic gizmo worked beautifully on cool autumn days, and Studebaker advertised it heavily. On hot summer afternoons in Texas, the brake fluid expanded, and the hill holder simply locked the brakes permanently. Drivers stuck at intersections in Dallas would press the gas pedal and go absolutely nowhere while traffic backed up behind them. The only real fix was waiting for the entire car to cool down completely. 65. Before 1956, tire valve stems were made of solid brass with no rubber base to absorb impacts. A sharp pothole could snap the entire stem clean off the wheel without any warning. The tire would instantly deflate with a loud whoosh that sounded like an angry tea kettle. A family in a Buick Roadmaster cruising through Ohio could lose a tire with no slow leak or chance to pull over safely. The car would lurch onto the bare rim within half a second and start carving up the asphalt underneath. Mechanics carried entire boxes of replacement stems because the failures were so routine across America. 66. Drum brake wheel cylinders were sealed with leather cups all the way through the 1940s, which sounds rustic and charming. The problem was that America has rain and humidity in many parts of the country. The leather rotted in damp climates like Florida and Louisiana, slowly letting brake fluid leak away one drop at a time. The driver had no warning at all that anything was wrong. The pedal felt fine in the morning, and then the brakes would simply fade away during the commute home. Mechanics in Miami learned to replace the leather every couple years. Most drivers never bothered with the maintenance. 67. The 1966 Oldsmobile Toronado was America's first mass-production front-wheel drive car since 1937, and it was a complete monster. The car weighed over 2 tons with a 425 cubic inch engine driving the front wheels through a massive transmission. There was no traction control of any kind because traction control had not been invented yet. On wet pavement, the Toronado would torque steer so violently that the wheel would yank itself right out of the driver's hands. A salesman pulling out of a rainy Detroit showroom could find himself facing the opposite direction within seconds. Oldsmobile called it advanced engineering. 68. Plymouth shipped the 1957 Fury with torsion bar suspension so aggressively stiff that it caused a strange new problem nobody expected. The narrow factory tires could literally unseat themselves from the rim during hard cornering on the highway. A Fury driver in Indiana taking a freeway off-ramp too fast would feel a sudden sickening lurch underneath the car. The tire would pop off the wheel like a cork leaving a champagne bottle. The car would drop onto the bare rim and slide sideways into the guardrail. Plymouth advertised the Fury as the most powerful sedan in America that year. They left out the tire problem. 69. The 1947 Tucker prototype had what Preston Tucker proudly called a padded dashboard, which sounded reassuring to nervous buyers. The padding turned out to be a 1/4 inch of horsehair felt glued onto a steel panel underneath. That is not really padding by any reasonable definition. That is just decoration sitting on top of solid steel. A passenger hitting that dashboard at 30 miles per hour would feel exactly as much cushion as hitting an oak board head first. Tucker advertised it as a major safety innovation in his glossy showroom brochures. Engineers who actually tested the prototype said it provided almost no meaningful protection at all. 70. Before 1955, fuel filler caps used cork gaskets to seal the gas tank against the metal neck. Cork has one extremely annoying property, which is that it dries out and shrinks over time. A driver in Nevada filling up his Hudson in summer would screw the cap on tight and head down the highway feeling confident. A sharp turn out of the gas station could send a fountain of raw gasoline spraying out of the filler neck onto the pavement. The fumes drifted into the cabin, and the car behind would drive through gas mist. Smokers occasionally ignited a trail of fire down the entire highway. 71. Before 1967, federal law had no requirement for collapsible steering columns, even though Mercedes-Benz had patented a perfectly good one back in 1959. American automakers knew the technology existed and chose to ignore it for almost a decade. The rigid steel column kept skewering drivers in every frontal collision across the country. Mercedes engineers in Germany were genuinely baffled by Detroit's stubborn refusal to license the design. The patent was available and the cost was reasonable. Ford and General Motors simply did not feel like changing their assembly lines. Thousands of American drivers died waiting for a piece of paper to get signed. 72. The 1965 Ford Mustang was the cultural sensation of its decade, and the optional seatbelt buckles were a proud safety feature in the brochures. Then Ford discovered the latch mechanism could release on its own under heavy crash loads. A driver who buckled up carefully in Los Angeles could find the belt unlatched mid-collision and end up through the windshield anyway. Ford issued a quiet recall once the lawsuits started piling up. The belts that were supposed to save lives were releasing at exactly the worst possible moment. Mustang owners learned that buckling up was only the first half of the gamble. 73. Before 1968, dashboard instrument clusters were covered with real glass panels over the speedometer and the gauges. The glass looked elegant and professional in showroom photographs. In any frontal crash, that glass shattered into needle-sharp shrapnel that flew straight at the driver's face. Emergency room doctors in Boston removed dashboard glass from accident victims. So often they kept tweezers specifically for the job. Plastic gauge covers existed and worked just as well visually. Detroit insisted real glass looked classier and refused to switch for years. The classier look came with a free face full of glass for anybody who crashed. 74. The 1948 Cadillac introduced the tail fin to American cars, and designer Harley Earl said the inspiration came from the P-38 Lightning fighter plane. The early chrome trim along those fins was sharp enough to slice a hand to the bone during routine washing. Dealership workers in Detroit reported needing stitches just from wiping down the rear quarter panels. The fins themselves got bigger and sharper every year through the 1950s. Cadillac owners proudly washed their cars and bled into the buckets. Pedestrians who got tagged by parked Cadillacs fared even worse. The most glamorous styling cue in American history was also a workplace hazard. 75. Before 1973, many sedans had their gas filler pipes running directly through the trunk compartment. A rear-end collision would rupture the pipe and fill the trunk with gasoline within seconds. The spare tire sitting back there created sparks against the metal as the car flexed from impact. The trunk essentially became an ignition chamber waiting for the right friction to set everything off. A family rear ended on the New Jersey Turnpike in their Plymouth could be sitting on top of a bomb without knowing it. The fix was rerouting the pipe outside the trunk. Detroit took its sweet time getting around to that. 76. The 1929 Duesenberg Model J was the most powerful luxury car in America, with a top speed of 119 miles per hour. The brakes were mechanical drums that needed over 250 feet of clear road to stop from that speed. That is almost the length of a football field just to slow down from highway pace. Wealthy owners cruising through Long Island would discover this math the hard way when something jumped into the road ahead. The Duesenberg was a rocket attached to a wheelbarrow brake system. Owners like to brag about the speed at country club parties. They rarely mentioned the stopping distance. 77. Before 1966, child car seats were marketed for visibility rather than safety because parents wanted their kids to see out the window. The seats raised toddlers up to window height, with no restraint of any kind. In a frontal crash, the child became the first thing ejected from the vehicle since they were already perched up high. Pediatricians watched the same tragedy unfold in emergency rooms, over and over again. The seats were sold in department stores next to the toys. Mothers genuinely believed they were buying safety equipment when they were buying launch pads. Real child restraints did not become standard until the 1970s. 78. The 1961 Jaguar E-Type was the most beautiful sports car of its decade, according to even Enzo Ferrari himself. The rear brakes were mounted inboard at the differential to reduce unsprung weight, which was clever engineering. The problem was that any brake fluid leak sprayed boiling hot fluid directly onto the rear suspension and the exhaust pipes. Owners in Connecticut would smell something burning and pull over to find their entire rear axle smoking. The fix required dropping the differential, which meant astronomical repair bills. The E-Type was a rolling work of art with a maintenance schedule that could bankrupt a small country. 79. The 1958 Lincoln Continental. Mark III had electric door locks, which were considered a luxury feature in the late 1950s. The wiring was prone to short circuits in damp weather across the Rust Belt states. When the wiring shorted, the system could lock all 4 doors at once and refuse to release them. Owners in Michigan reported needing to break their own windows to escape after even minor fender benders. A fire inside the cabin became a death sentence because the doors simply would not open. Lincoln advertised the locks as a convenience upgrade. The convenience came with a small chance of being roasted alive. 80. Before 1973, bumper jacks were the standard tire-changing tool included with every American car from the factory. They hooked into a slot on the bumper and lifted the entire corner of the vehicle. The jacks were notorious for slipping sideways under load and dropping cars onto whoever was changing the tire. Highway shoulders across America saw dozens of fatal jack failures every single year. Fathers changing a flat on Route 66 would end up pinned under their own Buick within seconds. The fix was the scissor jack, which actually stayed put. Detroit kept including bumper jacks until federal regulators basically told them to stop. 81. The 1956 Lincoln Premier came with an optional lifeguard design package that included a padded dashboard, a dished steering wheel, and seat belts. Ford genuinely believed safety would be the next big selling point, and they spent millions promoting the package across America. Customers walked into showrooms and pointed at the cheaper Chevrolets instead because safety apparently felt depressing. The lifeguard package flopped so badly that Ford executives concluded safety simply did not sell to American buyers. That conclusion poisoned the entire industry for the next 2 decades. Detroit stopped innovating safety features until federal law forced them. One failed marketing campaign cost untold lives across the country. 82. Before 1970, automatic transmissions could be shifted from park directly into reverse without pressing the brake pedal first. The driver simply moved the lever, and the car would start rolling backward immediately. Thousands of driveway accidents happened across America when somebody bumped the shifter while reaching for something on the dashboard. Toddlers playing behind family station wagons got rolled over with horrifying regularity in suburban neighborhoods. The fix was a simple interlock that required brake pressure before any gear change. Detroit refused to install it for decades because the engineering cost a few dollars per car. Federal regulators eventually mandated the safety feature. 83. Before 1973, headlamp aiming was performed by mechanics using a piece of chalk and a garage wall. The mechanic would draw a line, park the car at a measured distance, and eyeball whether the beams hit the mark. Most cars on American roads were aimed completely wrong because mechanics rushed the job or skipped it entirely. Oncoming drivers in Tennessee would get blinded by Buicks with headlights pointed straight at their faces. Pedestrians at intersections were invisible because beams aimed too low. Optical aiming machines existed in Europe for years. Detroit kept letting Earl in the garage do it with chalk and a steady hand. 84. Chevrolet built the 1965 Corvair Greenbrier as a passenger van on the doomed Corvair platform with the engine mounted behind the rear seats. The fuel tank lived directly in front of the rear passengers to balance the weight distribution evenly. A side impact crushed both the engine and the fuel tank straight into the cabin where the kids were sitting. Families across California bought Greenbriers to haul children on weekend camping trips to the coast. The layout turned every minor side collision into a potential fireball with passengers trapped between two compressed dangers. General Motors kept selling the Greenbrier until the lawsuits became too expensive to ignore. 85. The 1959 Chevrolet Impala had a hood so absurdly long that drivers literally could not see small children standing right in front of the bumper. The car was nearly 19 feet long from chrome to chrome, and the front sheet metal stretched on forever. Parents in suburban driveways across America were running over their own toddlers without even knowing the kids were there. Pediatric injury statistics from the early 1960s show a clear spike from these massive hood designs. The visibility problem was obvious to anybody who actually sat in the driver's seat. Chevrolet kept building them anyway because long hoods looked powerful and expensive in advertisements. 86. Studebaker rolled out the 1947 Champion with a famous wraparound rear window that made the back of the car look almost identical to the front. The styling was revolutionary for its era, and journalists called it the car that was coming and going at the same time. The problem was that drivers in parking lots would genuinely mistake the rear for the front and shift the wrong direction. Champion owners across Indiana reported throwing the gear shift into drive, expecting to pull forward and instead reversing into the car behind them. The styling joke became an actual insurance claim category. Studebaker thought confusion was a charming feature. 87. Before 1973, motorhomes were built by bolting wooden house bodies directly onto bare truck frames with almost no engineering between them. The rollover protection was often a single 2x4 beam running across the roof underneath the aluminum skin. A family vacationing across Wyoming in their brand new motorhome would tip in a crosswind, and the entire box would collapse like a cardboard refrigerator. There were no crash standards for recreational vehicles at all. The industry policed itself by basically not policing itself in any meaningful way. Survival inside a flipping motorhome was almost entirely a matter of pure luck. 88. The 1958 Chevrolet Impala offered optional air suspension that was supposed to deliver a magical floating ride across any road surface. The system used rubber airbags instead of traditional steel springs at all four corners. Airbags have one annoying property, which is that they slowly leak air overnight if the seals are not perfect. Impala owners across Michigan would walk out to their driveways at dawn and find the car sitting flat on the ground with its frame resting on the asphalt. Starting the engine pumped the bags back up over several minutes. The magical floating ride became a nightly humiliation in every neighborhood. 89. Tire chains for winter driving had end hooks that could shear off at highway speeds and become flying steel projectiles. A driver in Minnesota racing home through a snowstorm might hear a sharp metallic ping and not realize disaster had just been launched into traffic. The hooks punched through radiators, windshields, and occasionally drivers themselves on oncoming cars. Highway patrol officers in the upper Midwest reported finding these jagged hooks embedded in roadside trees and telephone poles. The chains worked beautifully for traction when they stayed together. The chains worked like medieval weapons when they did not. Winter driving was its own contact sport. 90. The 1949 Cadillac introduced the first overhead valve V8 engine in American history, and it was a genuine technological revolution. The new engine produced so much horsepower that it could easily outrun the car's drum brakes during hard stops. Cadillac engineers knew the brakes were inadequate for the power level before the car ever shipped. They sold it anyway because the engine was the selling point that customers wanted. Owners across Los Angeles discovered the math the hard way when something appeared in the road ahead. The new V8 made every Cadillac fast. The same Cadillac took an extra 100 feet to actually stop. 91. The Ford Model T had a gravity-fed fuel system that delivered gasoline from the tank into the carburetor through simple physics. The tank sat behind the engine at roughly the same height, which created an awkward little problem on steep hills. Going up a steep grade forward caused the fuel level to drop below the carburetor inlet, and the engine would simply starve. Drivers across the Appalachians learned to reverse up the worst hills so gravity would feed the engine properly. Tourists in Tennessee would watch confused as Model Ts backed up mountain roads in long, slow lines. Henry Ford considered this a perfectly acceptable workaround. 92. Buick equipped the 1955 Roadmaster with the Dynaflow automatic transmission that could be shifted into low gear at almost any speed. There was no mechanical lockout to prevent a driver from doing something catastrophically stupid by pure accident. A Roadmaster cruising at 70 miles per hour on the Pennsylvania Turnpike could have its lever bumped into low gear. The engine would instantly scream past redline, and the rear wheels would lock up from engine braking. The car would slide sideways across 3 lanes of highway traffic in a cloud of smoke. Buick knew about the design flaw and shipped the transmission anyway to save money. 93. Before 1960, windshield washer systems on most American cars had to be operated by a foot pump mounted on the floor. The driver had to physically stomp a button while still steering through a downpour and working the regular pedals. Mothers driving kids home through Iowa thunderstorms would essentially be playing a rhythm game with their feet. The pump often failed because the rubber diaphragms cracked from cold weather across the northern states. Electric washer pumps existed in Europe for years before Detroit bothered to adopt them in American cars. Drivers stomped their windshields clean 1 square inch at a time. 94. Buick introduced the 1953 Skylark with a wraparound windshield that curved dramatically around the front pillars for a futuristic look. The sharply curved corners actually distorted images in a way that hid pedestrians at intersections behind a visual blind spot. A driver pulling up to a stop sign in Chicago could literally not see somebody standing right next to the front fender. The styling looked beautiful in showroom photographs and proved absolutely deadly at busy urban intersections across the country. General Motors kept building wraparound windshields throughout the 1950s because customers loved how they looked from the outside. Pedestrians did not love them quite as much. 95. Before 1968, car horns were operated by a thin metal ring mounted inside the steering wheel itself. The driver pressed the ring with a thumb or palm to honk at jaywalkers and slow drivers ahead. In any frontal crash, the ring could spring loose from the wheel and become a sharp metal projectile. The ring would launch directly at the driver's throat with enough force to cause serious lacerations. Emergency rooms documented neck injuries from horn rings on accident victims with grim regularity across America. The fix was a horn button in the center of the wheel that stayed put during impact. 96. Chrysler installed autopilot cruise control in the 1958 Imperial, which was the first modern cruise system in an American car. The system would happily lock onto a speed above 30 miles per hour and hold it indefinitely on the highway. There was one small design oversight, which was that hitting the brake pedal did not turn the system off automatically. Drivers had to flip a dashboard toggle switch while simultaneously braking and steering during emergencies on country roads. An Imperial owner trying to avoid a deer in Ohio would discover this design flaw at the worst possible moment. Chrysler called it innovation. 97. Before 1965, spark plug wires on most American cars used uninsulated metal terminals that connected directly to the engine block. In wet weather, the moisture would create electrical arcs between the terminals and surrounding metal surfaces under the hood. The engine would simply stall in the middle of an intersection without any warning at all to the driver. A driver crossing a busy street in Seattle during a winter rainstorm could find the car dead in 3 seconds. Cross traffic would have absolutely no time to react before plowing through the stalled vehicle in the intersection. Insulated boots fixed everything for about 50 cents per wire. 98. Chevrolet built the 1963 Corvette Stingray as one of the most beautiful American cars ever designed for the road. The famous split rear window had a thick chrome bar running down the center that blocked the driver's rearward view. Changing lanes on the interstate in a split window, Stingray required a real leap of faith and a quick prayer. Chevrolet realized the visibility problem was actually dangerous and eliminated the split window after exactly one model year. Collectors today pay premium money for the 1963 specifically because of the doomed split design from that single year. The most coveted Corvette is also the blindest one. 99. Before 1973, American families regularly placed their kids in the rear cargo area of station wagons facing backward. There were no restraints of any kind back there because the space was officially considered luggage area by law. Children would wave at truckers behind them on Route 66 and play games on long road trips across the country. A rear-end collision would simply launch the kids straight through the back glass onto the highway at full speed. Pediatric trauma surgeons in the 1960s documented these ejections by the thousands every single year across America. Parents thought it was charming and freeing. Physics disagreed strongly. 100. Lincoln built the 1956 Continental Mark II as a halo car aimed at the wealthiest buyers in America that year. The car featured a hidden fuel filler door concealed behind the rear license plate that had to be unlatched. The plate would swing down on a small hinge to reveal the gas cap underneath for refueling at the station. Wealthy owners pulling out of country club gas stations would frequently forget to relatch the plate properly afterward. They would drive home at 60 miles per hour with the license plate dangling and clanging against the bumper. Sometimes the plate fell off entirely somewhere on the freeway. 101. Before 1955, manual transmissions had no synchronizer on first gear, which made downshifting a real adventure for American drivers. A missed shift on a steep hill could leave the car in neutral with no engine braking at all. The driver would suddenly find the car free rolling backward down the grade into oncoming traffic. Truckers in West Virginia learned to double-clutch every shift just to avoid disaster on mountain roads. Family sedans across the country had the same flaw, but with fewer experienced drivers. A simple grocery run in San Francisco could become a runaway nightmare in seconds. Synchronizers eventually saved transmissions and lives across America. 102. American Motors built the 1971 Gremlin by literally cutting the back end off an existing AMC Hornet sedan. The result was an awkward, stubby hatchback with the gas tank sitting only inches from the rear bumper. Any meaningful rear-end collision would punch the tank straight into the cabin in a shower of gasoline. AMC marketed the Gremlin as the cheapest new car in America at under $2,000. The price was definitely cheap, and the engineering was definitely cheaper still. Owners in Detroit nicknamed it the Rolling Lawsuit because of the obvious fuel tank exposure. AMC kept building Gremlins for almost a full decade. 103. Before 1968, rearview mirrors on most American cars were mounted to the top of the dashboard with a heavy steel bracket. The mirror itself weighed about 4 pounds and sat directly in front of the front passenger. In any frontal crash, that mirror would break free and become a flying steel projectile aimed straight at somebody's face. Emergency room doctors saw forehead injuries from dashboard mirrors with disturbing frequency throughout the 1950s. The fix was simple, which was mounting mirrors to the windshield with a breakaway adhesive bracket. Detroit eventually adopted the design after enough lawsuits piled up on the desks of corporate attorneys. 104. Citroën introduced the 1955 DS with revolutionary hydropneumatic suspension that used pressurized fluid instead of traditional springs at all 4 corners. The system gave the car a magical floating ride that no other vehicle on the road could match at the time. If the central pressure pump ever failed, the entire car would drop to the ground and become completely undrivable. American owners in California reported their DS sedans collapsing onto the pavement during routine commutes without any warning. The repair required specialized French parts that took months to import across the Atlantic. The most advanced suspension in the world had one very expensive failure mode. 105. Before 1970, spare tires were stored underneath the trunk floor with no retaining strap or bracket holding them down securely. A rear-end collision would launch the tire straight up through the trunk lid and into the back seat at full impact speed. Children riding in the rear of family sedans across America were getting hit by their own spare tires during otherwise survivable crashes. The fix was a simple nylon strap that cost about $1 to install at the factory. Detroit refused to add the strap for decades because nobody was demanding it loudly enough. The spare tire became its own crash hazard. 106. Chrysler launched the 1934 Airflow with a radically streamlined body that looked completely unlike anything else on American roads at the time. The car was actually quite advanced from an engineering perspective, with proper weight distribution and aerodynamics built in. Buyers walked into showrooms and genuinely asked dealers if the cars had been crashed before delivery because the styling looked so unusual. Sales collapsed almost immediately, and the Airflow became one of the biggest flops in American auto history. Detroit learned a brutal lesson, which was that innovation could absolutely destroy a company overnight. Chrysler retreated to conservative styling for the next 20 years to avoid repeating the disaster. 107. Before 1966, station wagon liftgates used a single chrome handle that could freeze solid during winter weather across the northern states. Cargo and rear-facing children inside the wagon would be trapped until somebody thawed the latch with hot water. A mother in Minnesota loading groceries could find herself locked out of her own wagon during a January blizzard. Kids riding in the rear cargo area had no internal release whatsoever because the design assumed adults would always open the gate from outside. The fix was a heated latch or an internal handle. Detroit installed neither feature for years after the obvious problem appeared. 108. The 1955 Ford Crown Victoria came with a distinctive chrome roof band that wrapped completely around the top of the car for styling. That chrome band turned out to be a structural part of the roof rather than just decorative trim like buyers assumed. A rollover crash that bent the band would cause the entire roof to collapse straight down into the cabin space. Owners across Ohio discovered the problem the hard way during otherwise survivable single-car accidents on country roads. Ford never warned buyers about the structural role of the chrome band in any owner literature. The styling feature was actually holding the roof up the whole time. 109. Before 1973, hood latches across American cars relied on a single mechanical hook to hold the hood closed at highway speed. A driver who failed to secure the latch properly after checking the oil could have a major problem within minutes. The hood would fly up at speed and slam against the windshield, completely covering the driver's forward view. A father in Ohio merging onto the interstate could suddenly find himself driving completely blind at 60 miles per hour. Secondary safety catches existed in Europe for years before Detroit bothered adopting them. American drivers steered by feel and prayer until the law finally changed. 110. Ford rolled out the 1971 Pinto with a fuel filler neck that connected to the tank through a simple rubber sleeve clamp. Even minor rear-end impacts could separate the filler neck from the tank itself in less than a second. Gasoline would then pour directly under the rear axle and onto the hot exhaust pipe within moments. The Pinto's fuel system had multiple independent failure modes that all led to the same explosive outcome. Ford engineers documented every single one of these problems before the car ever shipped to dealers. The Grush-Sonby report calculated that lawsuits were cheaper than fixes. America paid the difference in funerals. 111. Drum brake handbrake cables ran completely exposed underneath American cars throughout most of the 20th century without any protective covering. Rust could seize these cables solid right in the middle of an application by the driver on a cold morning. A driver in Buffalo pulling the handbrake in a snowy parking lot might find the cable refusing to release afterward. The car would sit there with the rear brakes permanently locked on, while the owner pulled the lever uselessly. Mechanics across the Rust Belt charged a small fortune to crawl underneath and replace the seized cables one by one. America accepted that parking brakes were basically a winter gamble for decades, and that was 111 ways early American cars tried their absolute best to send drivers straight to the great highway in the sky. From chrome harpoons on Cadillacs to Pintos that exploded on contact, Detroit really did treat safety like an optional extra for decades. If you laughed, cringed, or thanked your lucky stars, You were born after airbags were invented. Then, you already know what to do next. Smash that like button, drop a comment telling us which one shocked you the most, and subscribe to Dumb History for more ridiculous stories from the past. Hit that notification bell too so you never miss the next batch of historical chaos.